The original ancestor of the Salish people, his name was Mohawk, and that's the word for rain.
Fresh water and the salt waters are the life's blood of the Earth Mother. So everything around us relies on that, including all wildlife and, of course, fish and the forest and just everything.
They talk about water as a commodity. It's something that people must have control and own. For us, we don't own it, we don't control it, we look after it.
When we look at the Earth from space, one of the first things we notice is just how much of it is covered by water. Water is one of the most abundant substances on Earth. 3/4 of our planet's surface is covered by oceans, lakes, rivers, and swamps. It's in the air we breathe, in the soil, and if we drill down, we find the rocks under our feet are also full of water. All living things on Earth depend on it. Without water, there would be no life. With all this water around, it might seem that we should have no problems finding enough, but all those animals and plants, including us, that live on land, need fresh water, not salt water. And most of the world's water is in the huge oceans. Only a tiny fraction, 2.75% of the Earth's water, is fresh water. And nearly all, 99% of that fresh water, is either frozen in glaciers or is deep underground. Only a small percent of the Earth's fresh water is available to us as surface water in lakes and rivers, making it a truly precious gift, something which has always been understood by indigenous peoples.
Today it is viewed as a resource for financial gain, but to the native people of the land, it's sacred. It's a healing tool.
To us, every little stream, no matter how small it is, has a purpose, and each one of those little streams has a spirit, and each one of those things brings life to something else.
In Canada, we are lucky. We have access to a high proportion of the Earth's fresh water, about 9% of the total amount. We are used to thinking of a lack of clean water as being a third world problem, but this isn't always true. Walkerton may have made the headlines, but there are many more communities in Canada without access to safe, clean water. Across the country, the number of incidents of water advisories is alarmingly high. Currently, there are over 1,000 in effect across Canada. Worse still, Although some of these were resolved within a short time, over 75% of these advisories have been in place for longer than 1 year. And around 10% have been in place for longer than 10 years. Many of these are on First Nations reserves.
There's about 160 communities that are on boil water advisories out of about 650. So that's about 1 in 5 First Nations. And, people have to, try to imagine living life where, you're in overcrowded housing. Food supply is not always guaranteed in a remote community. Then you don't have access to clean water for drinking.
A lot of those are long-standing, so we're not, it's often said, oh, well, drinking advisories come and go depending on the water conditions coming into the plant. But in a lot of First Nations, if you look, they come on and they stay.
Water is fundamental, and the concept of not having access to clean water, basically 3 issues. One is for drinking, the other one is for personal hygiene, and the third is for food preparation. And with H1N1 last year, the issues of hygiene came out with the spread of infectious diseases when you don't have access to clean water every day to clean.
The best way to think about it is to go through your own day and notice every time you turn on the tap and use the water, and then think about, well, what if I couldn't do that? Now what?
Boil water advisories are issued when it is suspected that the water may have become contaminated. Boil water orders are issued if evidence indicates that the water may be responsible for an outbreak of illness. Both of these advisories are usually issued if the cause of the problem is contamination of the water by bacteria or parasites, which are killed by boiling. Tap water must be boiled for at least 1 minute before drinking it, using it for brushing teeth or using it for food preparation. The tap water should not be used for bathing small children. A do not drink advisory is issued if the water is unsafe to use even when boiled. This can be caused by chemical pollution in the water supply and purification system, or by problems with the water source.
Started in the late 80s that we were not informed of the high levels of arsenic, especially arsenic and ammonia and all the bad things in the water. As far as I can understand and look back to, the tests were taken, but there seems to be an ongoing problem of sharing this information between 2 government agencies, Health Canada and Indian Affairs. To our reserve, we have very high cancer rates, death rates, very high diabetes, and different types of respiratory problems, any type of problem. Now, the more I get to know about this impurities in water, all these arsenics, these ammonias, these H2S, everything. It is one thing that's in common to all the people on our reserve, is water. In my own personal life, my wife's a cancer survivor, and I've lost our one and only child this past August to cancer. So maybe I am taking a little harder view than normally, but I do believe that there is some wrongs being done to the native population by not releasing this type of information.
There is a community in Quebec. I was really shocked when I found out that they don't have piped water at home. They have, it's about 65, 70 houses. They, at the middle of the community, they have a community shower. Okay? And in front of the convenience store, one store, there is a pipe, and they would have to go and collect their water. Think about minus 40 in winter. You requiring a shower or you needing some water. You walk out and get your water. Which Canadian would ever accept that?
Providing small communities with safe drinking water is an important responsibility. Nanoose Bay on Vancouver Island, home of the Snaw-Nawas First Nation, has a modern water treatment plant and its own certified operator.
My name is James Cook. I'm from Nanoose First Nation. I'm a certified potable water operator, and that entails making sure that the drinking water, which is potable water, is safe for community. We have aquifers where the pumps are submerged, and they are close to 50 feet underground. You have to make sure that the chlorine dose that is going to your water supply has enough residual in it that when it goes out into community, that you can still find a certain amount of chlorine by the time it comes out the person's house, like every person in community. We're about as close as we can be to perfect right now, but if we wanted to, we could change it. The older style treatment plants run chlorine pumps out of drums of liquid chlorine, which can be dangerous, and the pumps were prone to fail. With this system, it's actually very simple because it's a sleeve so long, and you can probably put about 14 pucks in there at a time. You wouldn't have to add to that, I would think, for about 3 weeks if you didn't want to. A lot of people will say that they have flu-like symptoms. That could be minor bacteria in the water. And that's part of the water purveyor's job, is to hear, when he hears community members talk about these things, that gives me the opportunity to go back over my records and find out if my residuals are right, and maybe it might be a person just being sick. But if you have too many people complaining of the same thing, I'm not doing my job right, which has not ever happened.
Nanoose Bay is an example of what should be happening in small communities. So what's going wrong in so many other communities across the country?
It's happened gradually, and different communities are in different places. I mean, some communities, their water is fine. In some cases, it comes from changes in the source water, or improperly matched equipment with the source water.
The water systems are small. They require a lot of intense operation. They require treatment, and they require funding. And a lot of times, all of those pieces are not in place.
They may have someone who operates the system who may do it on a voluntary basis or is not paid much. Certainly none of them can afford to employ a full-time operator. So they make do, they compromise.
Another challenge is chronic underfunding of the system. So it's easier to get project money to put a system in place, but then having the money on hand to keep it operating over a number of years. You know, governments like funding projects, they don't like funding programs that go on forever because they don't end. So
there's also a problem with the way water quality is regulated on First Nations reserves. The federal government is responsible for the construction of water treatment plants on First Nation land, but only sets guidelines for water quality which are not legally enforceable. Provincial governments are responsible for regulating water quality in provinces, but provincial governments have no control over First Nations reserves, as reserves fall under federal jurisdiction.
Well, right now for First Nations living on reserve, there are no regulations that apply because that's managed provincially across the country, but reserves are managed federally, and so there are no federal regulations for drinking water because it's managed provincially.
It gets pretty complicated where the environment where they're drawing the water from falls under the jurisdiction of provincial government. The drinking water treatment plant falls under the jurisdiction of federal government. And so each other stepping on each other's toes, often we don't succeed in implementing anything.
The federal government has recognized that there are problems with water quality on First Nations reserves. Bill S-11, the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, which is currently before Parliament, will give the government greater powers to monitor and control the quality of water on reserves. It is already being criticized for not allocating any extra funding to improve water treatment facilities.
Governments have a tendency to defer to economic models of decision-making, and small groups of indigenous peoples are not really an important part of that decision-making process, except now when we are ending up in the courts and the courts saying, look, you have to deal with these peoples, you have to deal with the indigenous peoples, you have to understand the impacts that you're creating. So it's a decision, the impacts on the indigenous peoples in that area and the impacts on the shareholders' wallet in New York. You know, who ends up winning? Historically, the shareholders' wallet wins, and our communities end up paying the price. And now we're going to have to balance that and saying, look, enough's enough, and we're going to have to start changing the dynamics of how decisions are made, what projects get approved, how these projects are reviewed and approved, and what are the consequences of any project.
These are all important issues, but many involved in water management are becoming aware that focusing only on creating safe drinking water may lead to other problems in the future.
It is the thought process that any water can be treated to make it drinkable and safe. Okay? So the philosophy is that safe drinking water can be, provided through treatment. Okay? Now the question is that water could be safe, but is it healthy? When we add chlorine to the water to disinfect, to kill all the bacteria and virus, what we are doing is we are oxidizing all the carbon that's in the water. So chlorine is an oxidant. So that's how it kills everything. So what happens is while we are killing the bacteria and viruses, making it safe, we are oxidizing the carbon and creating chlorinated hydrocarbons. So many of which are carcinogens to us. So the more polluted water you're trying to treat, more byproducts you will produce while you are trying to make it safe. That water may not kill you instantaneously, but it might be killing you slowly. So in our current system, if something is killing you slowly, then no action is required.
So treatment, while it is an essential part of the clean water process, is not the only thing we need to consider. Treating water which is heavily contaminated can produce carcinogens. In the long term, this safe drinking water may prove deadly.
The problems with drinking water are symptomatic of much larger scale issues, and so I tend to want to go sort of back behind the pipes and to look not just at the technical solutions in terms of pipes or infrastructure or filtration systems, but to be looking back to the source of the water, what's happening in terms of where that water is coming from. And so for me, we can say, am I happy with the quality of water that's coming out of the tap? Or we could ask, am I happy with the quality of water that's entering into the sources of the water? And my primary concerns are about how we're thinking about the quality and the quantity of water at its source. And that is because its value is not just for the people that are drinking it, but it's also for the entire ecosystem that's dependent on it.
Water is not just a commodity for our use. The entire natural world around us and every living thing in it depends on the water that is constantly flowing through it. Water follows its own course and will carve a path through or around any obstacle that it might meet. Along the way, it picks up and absorbs part of every environment that it flows through, whether natural or introduced by us. It totally ignores all our political boundaries. We may delay it or divert it to help us grow crops, but we can never stop it or fully control it, only live alongside it.
I think we've been distanced from water in its life-giving elements. We have come to see it as something that comes out of a tap and it is something that we turn on or turn off, rather than something that is underpinning every aspect of our daily processes. Even when we are right next to a river, often we're just thinking about the water flowing through the river as compared to the landscapes from which it's come, the whole waterways as the lifeblood of the landscape idea.
If we're talking about water quality problems that we may have, they actually may be problems with how we're doing agriculture or how we're doing forestry. And if we focus too closely on talking about it as a water problem, we'll miss these fundamental connections that are there with other things that we're doing.
The pollution and environmental damage that can be caused by heavy industries is well known, but we often think about it locally, affecting a small area. We've all seen these images from the Alberta oil sands, but the polluted tailings ponds are located close to the Athabasca River, so potentially, any escape of pollution from the ponds could affect a much larger area. And because we are so used to the political boundaries that govern all our activities, we forget that water and any pollution that gets into it uses its own very different maps. We all recognize the map of North America and the way it's split into countries, states, and provinces. In fact, these divisions are so familiar that we tend to think of them as real physical lines on the landscape. But of course, they don't really exist. A map of the major watersheds looks very different to the map we know so well. But this map shows real physical divisions on the landscapes and shows how large and interconnected some of these watersheds are. Once we begin to think of water as existing holistically within watersheds, then we can much better control the quality of the water that we need. There are over 150 boil water advisories currently in place on First Nations reserves in Canada, and more are being added every year. Lack of investment, aging infrastructure, shortage of skilled operators, confusion, and lack of oversight from the government. All of these things are contributing to the problems. But First Nations peoples have an important role to play in teaching all of us that so many of our current ideas about water management are contributing to our present problems and possibly creating much bigger ones in the future.
We had a water source for 40 years that never had been contaminated, and then ironically, the outskirts on the upper side of our watershed, outside of our First Nation, started being developed, and that's when we got contamination in our water. And that's when all the bright lights went on and somebody said, you now have to start chlorinating, because it's just a necessary evil.
Aboriginal peoples have always had strong connection to the land and the water, and have lived harmoniously with the natural world for many thousands of years. They understand that these things cannot be owned. We can only ever be caretakers for future generations. This is especially true of water. We cannot create it or easily control it. We can only take care of it. This is the only way to ensure that we all have access to clean water into the future. If we lose this sacred gift, there will be no future.
All of those things are living. They're all God. You know, they're all part of creation, and they have to be understood that way. When they're not understood that way, when the water and the salmon's not understood that way, then they become a commodity. They become a dollar sign, and they're not about life and the life force and the living part and the health that we require.
When I was fishing with my grandfather and my uncles, my dad, they talked about the water warming up way back in the 40s. It was already warm. And say around mid-40s. And the indicator was the salmon were no longer in shallow water. They had moved into deep water where it's colder. So we knew then that the change was coming, but because we're not scientists or anything like that, we're not supposed to know about it. But my grandfather and our grandfathers before that knew the water because of our relationship. That's where our food is at. Everything is in the water.
One of our stories goes back to, our history story says that there's going to be a time when the people are going to be buying water. So that's a kind of like a prophecy that was foretold to our people a very long time ago, right? So it's something that we knew that was coming. And then, yeah, I drink most of my water from bottled water, you're right.
Any project or any development or any initiatives relating to water, it's got to be seen from an important cultural perspective that water is sacred, not just to indigenous peoples, but to all peoples. And if you contaminate that water, then you're contaminating your own life. You got to remember and understand in that you're not just contaminating your own life, and you're contaminating all other life forms, you know, that depend on the water. So you have to be mindful that what you do to that water, you're doing to everything else and to yourself.